Establishing outward pressure, this opening gambit immediately contests central space and prompts a strategic decision from the opponent. Opening the path for the queen and bishop, preparing a solid, classical pawn structure against the English. Developing a knight to c3 prepares kingside castling and fights for central influence alongside the c-pawn. Immediately challenging the center creates dynamic pawn tension, potentially opening lines for both sides. Establishing central pawn presence, white stakes a claim for the initiative and opens lines for piece development. Developing a knight here naturally supports the central pawn and prepares for kingside castling while contesting the d4 square. Opening a central diagonal creates immediate attacking prospects for white's pieces. Establishing a solid pawn center, this recapture immediately opens diagonals for your bishops and prepares for future piece development. Unpinning the knight allows for a direct central pawn push, potentially opening lines for piece activity and creating attacking chances against the king's cover. Safeguarding the king, this piece solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling, creating a robust defensive formation. Solidifying the center's structure and preparing for piece development, this cautious advance unlocks the queen's diagonal and prepares kingside castling. Securing the king's safety by castling is a sound defensive maneuver, bringing the monarch to a more protected square behind a pawn shield. Developing the bishop to target the castled king's immediate safety, this piece prepares for a potential kingside attack. Fortifying the queenside with the knight, preparing for potential central pawn pushes or a queenside expansion. Developing this knight solidifies the pawn center and prepares for potential kingside activity by reinforcing the f3 square. Unblocking the bishop, the rook embarks on its journey, aiming for active participation on the open e-file. Unyielding control of the c-file crystallizes, a prelude to potential d-pawn pressure and a subtle threat to the enemy monarch's safety. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential pawn break, this move anchors black's position while allowing for future flexibility. Securing the monarch now opens avenues for a central pawn advance and unified piece development. A logical repositioning, the knight seeks a more active square, potentially aiming for g6 to bolster kingside defense or even heading to e5. Exchange achieved, disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially opening lines for an eventual kingside attack. Recapturing with the bishop clarifies the center and repositions a key defender, preparing to challenge the opponent's active dark-squared bishop. Expanding on the queenside aims to create persistent pressure and open lines for the rook. Unpinning the knight and offering a piece exchange aims to simplify the position and disrupt white's development. Anchoring the knight on d2 solidifies control over the c4 square and prepares a potential advance on the queenside. Reasserting control of the open c-file becomes paramount now that white has developed its queenside pawn majority. Asserting control over the d5 pawn and preparing to target weaknesses in black's queenside structure. Exchanging the bishop eliminates a key defender of white's king, but weakens black's pawn structure. Liberating the queen opens lines and targets that previously blocked assessment. A bid to activate the queen and challenge the d4 pawn, seeking to equalize the central pawn structure. Simplifying the position, white initiates an exchange that transitions towards an endgame, aiming to leverage piece activity. Opening the d-file for your rook, this knight repositioning aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and initiate a more active middle game. Probing the queenside by advancing the pawn, aiming to seize crucial space and potentially create weaknesses on black's periphery. Retreating the bishop offers a safe haven, preparing for future pawn advances along the queenside. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain, b4 establishes a presence and aims to restrict black's mobility. Reactivating the knight towards the queenside allows for potential queenside expansion and prepares for a central pawn push. Expanding on the queenside aims to restrict black's knight and potentially initiate a pawn break. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure with this advance, Black prepares to contest the open c-file and solidify their queenside presence. Reclaiming central influence, the knight maneuvers toward the queenside to challenge Black's space. Initiating a repositioning maneuver, the bishop retreats to an active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs and offering defensive support. Asserting influence on the queenside, this knight aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially target vulnerable squares. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank aims to contest the open file and potentially harass the white king later. Securing the king is a priority, but that slumbering king on f1 now creates a potential weakness. Liberating the knight from its cramped position on the square, this maneuver prepares to contest the central files and potentially target weaknesses on the queenside. Securing the monarch's central position is a priority, setting up potential kingside pawn advances. Recentering the knight offers flexibility, potentially preparing to challenge white's queenside space advantage. A deliberate repositioning to secure the d-pawn and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, potentially ushering in a more dynamic middle game. Reclaiming the central file for rook activity significantly improves Black's piece coordination. Solidifying the kingside presence, the rook now eyes the open file, ready for any eventual pawn pushes. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure solidifies Black's position against any future breakthroughs. Consolidating defensive forces, this rook repositions to a safer square, anticipating potential pawn advances. Solidifying the pawn structure to prevent knight infiltration, this prepares for eventual central pawn advances and opens lines for the rook. Recentralizing the rook aims to improve its defensive capabilities on the open file, anticipating potential pawn advances. Repositioning the bishop to this diagonal might be aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure or activate it for a future attack on the kingside. Initiating a knight repositioning maneuver toward the kingside, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and improve piece activity. Reorganizing the bishop behind the pawn chain offers better defensive coverage for the kingside. Reorienting the knight toward the kingside opens new attacking avenues and pressures Black's central pawn structure. Re-establishing the bishop's post on h6 offers a surprising avenue for kingside pressure, disrupting white's comfortable central control. Securing the kingside pawn structure prevents potential breakthroughs and stabilizes white's position. Shifting the king to the kingside offers a touch more security and prepares to contest the central files more actively. Attempting to build a queenside presence by advancing the kingside pawns, but this weakens the king's safety. A strategic retreat, the bishop repositions to better defend against potential pawn advances and prepare for a quiet regrouping of Black's forces. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure aims to prevent any immediate Black infiltration, solidifying white's defensive setup. Reinvigorating the kingside pawn structure with f6 now presents an opportunity to challenge white's advanced a pawn and seize initiative. Repositioning the knight for better control over the queenside outpost seems a sensible idea. Liberating the knight to occupy this outpost grants Black significant central influence and opens avenues for an eventual queenside pawn thrust. Reinforcing the e4 square and preparing potential pawn advances on the kingside. Stepping back to the g7 bishop reevaluates defensive coverage on the kingside and prepares for potential maneuvers. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, this ambitious thrust seeks to tear open lines for attacking pieces. Reigniting activity on the kingside by intending to advance the f-pawn offers counterplay, potentially opening lines for Black's pieces. Repositioning the knight to d2 reestablishes a flexible defensive outpost while preparing for potential central advances or counterplay. Reclaiming the d6 square with the knight prepares to challenge white's imposing knight on the queenside. Reclaiming the central e-file is paramount to reactivating white's pieces and potentially breaking through Black's solid defense. Unpinning the knight and preparing to challenge the central pawn structure, a subtle repositioning. Recapturing the pawn on f1 after black's capture allows white to maintain central pawn presence and prepare for potential rook activity on the open file. Repositioning the rook to the b-file aims to challenge white's queenside pawn majority and potentially create dynamic play. Opening the rook file offers an immediate avenue for piece activity and potential breakthroughs on the queen side. Reconnecting the rooks offers flexibility, preparing to contest the central files and potentially shift pressure. Preparing to reroute the rook for a potential kingside push while keeping central pressure on. Repositioning the rook to b8 prepares to contest the open b-file, aiming for greater mobility and potential pressure on white's queenside. Pushing the e-pawn begins a potential kingside pawn storm, aiming to disrupt black's defense and gain central space. Capturing the pawn creates open lines, but it might expose your king more. Centralizing the knight reclaims initiative and prepares to exploit weaknesses on the king side. Reclaiming the open c-file with the knight allows for improved central pressure. Reclaiming central control with the knight is a sensible step, aiming to improve its outpost potential. A timely capture, freeing the rook and preparing to contest the central files with renewed vigor. Recapturing the pawn opens the rook's file, potentially reigniting attacking chances. Capturing the knight on c5 severs white's central pawn chain and opens lines for black's rook, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Opening the b-file grants crucial counterplay and creates active threats against black's isolated pawns. Opening the d-file creates opportunities for the rook to infiltrate and challenge white's pawn structure. Capturing the knight drastically simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the open files. Opening the file grants white a structural advantage, aiming to exploit the isolated pawn. Unlocking the f-file offers immediate central tension and potential for pawn pushes. Opening the king's defenses presents significant risks, and capturing the pawn invites a perilous endgame struggle. Opening the g-file creates immediate attacking possibilities around black's king. Bringing the rook to the g-file activates a forgotten piece and challenges white's control over open lines. Centralizing the king offers its safety and better defensive and offensive possibilities. The rook vacates the dangerous open file, allowing for better defensive coordination and preparation for potential exchanges. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount as white repositions the rook to defend against potential pawn thrusts and prepares for future central advances. Pivoting the rook to this active file offers surprising counterplay against white's exposed king. Aiding the monarch's escape route from potential skewers or checks now. The king's march to the center, while seemingly bold, leaves it exposed to potential disruptions along the now open diagonals. Opening a new avenue for the queen to penetrate and exert pressure along the queen side. Sacrificing a pawn to expose white's king opens up critical counterplay. The king ventures out, seeking out potential attacking possibilities while aiming to support the advancing pawn. Confronting the king becomes a primary objective as the pawn advances, aiming to disrupt black's defenses. Suddenly, the king's escape route is blocked, a stark reminder of positional dangers. Bending the pawn structure to create an escape square for the king, sacrificing immediate central control. Unleashing the pawn opens a decisive central battleground. Reclaiming central space is the priority, though the doubled pawns on the queen side present a long-term structural weakness. A decisive check, forcing the king into an exposed position and signaling the end of black's hopes. Consolidating material near the king is paramount given the open lines. Reclaiming the d-file allows for active rook play and pressures black's isolated passed pawn. Opening the queen side to potentially activate the queen and counter white's pawns. Unlocking the king's diagonal assault, the rook surges forward to join the pawn storm. Opening the queen side allows for a swift attack, threatening to dismantle white's pawn structure. Capturing that passed pawn on c3 unleashes a decisive threat towards black's uncastled king. The king scrambles for safety, but the queenside pawn majority is no longer the primary threat. Clearing the path for the rook to dominate the 7th rank creates immediate pressure. Sacrificing material to open lines for your remaining pieces is a desperate gamble. A desperate king hunt begins as the rook penetrates the opposition's weakened defenses. Sacrificing the pawn on a6 is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's queen and rook coordination before the inevitable checkmate. Unleashing a decisive check, white forces the king's retreat into a cramped position. The king, once so secure, is now a glaring weakness exposed to the relentless pressure from the rook and pawn. The king's march towards the action is essential to support the rook and pawns in the critical pawn race unfolding. The king's exposed position after the pawn push invites further harassment and makes recapturing on the queen side a dangerous proposition. This captures the pawn and opens the f-file, aiming to activate the rook for potential mating threats. The rook's relocation to f4 offers crucial defensive coverage for the endangered pawn structure. A dramatic queen sacrifice has paved the way for a swift pawn avalanche towards the black king. The rook's aggressive thrust towards the open king creates an immediate tactical threat, potentially forcing a king escape or a material sacrifice. The king's exposed position invites a forced sequence culminating in a perpetual check or decisive material gain. The king is exposed by the pawn push, begging for a decisive check. Opening the file for the rook allows immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. The rook recaptures, aiming to salvage some material from a dire situation, though victory is now out of reach. Unleashing the rook onto the open g-file, this aggressive thrust aims to exploit the exposed black king. The rook's maneuver to f6 aims to preserve its defensive post, anticipating potential threats against the king on the light squares. Unleashing the rook's power creates an immediate royal threat, forcing a critical defensive maneuver. The black king, exposed and abandoned, faces a swift and decisive conclusion from the invading white pieces. Unleashing the rook's power, this check aims to dislodge black's king and exploit the open files, a classic endgame maneuver. King escape feels paramount now, trying to outmaneuver the powerful rook and pawn push. The rook's ascent now pressures the pinned pawn, potentially forcing a decisive pawn push to seize control of the 7th rank.